Some secrets bury themselves deep within the cracks of a family, but when silence becomes heavier than truth, it poisons every bond. Between father and daughter, the secret no one spoke of unravels a story where love is tangled with betrayal, and silence hides scars that scream louder than words. Rachel thought her father was her protector, but the truth she uncovers will shatter everything she ever believed about family, trust, and blood. Rachel's innocent trust hides unseen cracks, but the cracks were never obvious at first glance. To anyone looking in from the outside, she was the daughter who laughed freely, who shared stories at the dinner table, who leaned her head against her father's shoulder with the comfort of someone who felt safe. Her smile seemed real, her eyes bright, her voice light when she called him Dad. Yet, beneath the glow of her laughter lived shadows she never dared to name. Her trust was not a choice, it was something she was taught to give, a belief planted in her since childhood, that fathers are protectors, that they stand like walls against the world's storms. Rachel carried this belief like scripture, never questioning, never doubting, because to doubt her father would mean doubting the very foundation of her life. But innocence, when misplaced, has a way of cracking quietly. It doesn't shatter all at once. It bends, it warps, it bruises before it ever breaks. Rachel began to notice small things. First, his eyes lingering too long on her when she thought he wasn't watching, the weight of silence that followed certain questions, the way her mother's lips pressed tightly together whenever she brought up childhood memories. She told herself it was nothing, that families have their own unspoken rules, that some moments are too strange to understand. Trust pushed those questions deep into the corners of her mind, building walls around them so they couldn't escape. The cracks widened in the quiet moments. When she was alone in her room, she felt the presence of something she couldn't name, as though her past was whispering to her, warning her that not everything was as it seemed. She tried to ignore it, burying herself in schoolwork, in friendships, in late-night conversations with people who never knew what she carried. Yet, even in laughter, she felt the tremors of unease, like tiny earthquakes beneath her feet, reminding her that the ground she stood on wasn't as solid as she believed. There were times her father would reach out to her with too much intensity, his voice warm but his eyes unreadable. Times when his love seemed like a chain disguised as affection, holding her closer than she wanted to be. Rachel learned to smile through the discomfort, to play the part of the daughter who never doubted, never questioned, never pulled away. She believed that obedience would keep the peace, that silence would protect her from something she couldn't yet admit. But every time she forced that smile, every time she swallowed her unease, the cracks inside her trust spread a little wider. Her mother's silence only deepened the confusion. Rachel noticed how her mother's gaze would flicker whenever her father entered the room, how her voice softened, almost as though she were afraid of being too loud. There were moments when Rachel caught her mother staring at her with a sadness that made her uneasy, like she knew something Rachel didn't, something she couldn't bring herself to speak aloud. Rachel wanted to ask, but the fear of the answer froze her tongue. Her mother's silence was not just silence, it was complicity, an unspoken warning that some truths are too dangerous to uncover. As Rachel grew older, the trust she once held like armor began to feel heavy, suffocating. She began to sense the contradictions between what she felt and what she was told. A father is supposed to be a protector, yet why did her chest tighten when he entered her room without knocking? A father is supposed to offer comfort, yet why did his words sometimes sound like traps, heavy with meaning she couldn't fully understand? She carried these questions like ghosts, lingering in the back of her mind, haunting her even when she tried to push them away. In the eyes of the world, she was still the perfect daughter. To her friends, she was lively, dependable, strong. To her teachers, she was intelligent and ambitious. To her family, she was quiet, obedient, safe. But inside, she felt the constant strain of pretending, of holding together the mask of innocence while the truth pressed harder against the cracks. Every time she smiled for the sake of peace, every time she laughed when she wanted to cry, she felt herself slipping further from who she truly was. Her trust was no longer pure, it was fractured, fragile, and weighed down by shadows she couldn't yet face. And so, the cracks widened, silent but undeniable. She couldn't name them, couldn't confess them, but she could feel them, like hairline fractures in glass, spreading slowly, almost invisibly, until one day, the entire surface would no longer hold. Rachel's innocence remained on display, a delicate illusion crafted for the world around her. But beneath it, the truth waited, patient and merciless, pressing against the walls of her silence, demanding to be seen, Asterisk, a father's shadow stretches darker than love, and Rachel learned that shadows are often heavier than the light they come from. To the world, her father was respected, a man who spoke with authority, who carried himself with the calm confidence of someone admired in his community. People praised his discipline, his wisdom, the way he held his family together. They saw a man who sacrificed for his daughter, who kept her safe under his roof. But Rachel knew that shadows grow longer when the light is too bright. His affection was never simple, never just love. It carried weight, control, and a presence that swallowed her whole. When she was young, she thought his rules were protection. She believed his strictness meant care, his anger meant worry, his silence meant strength. He convinced her that love required obedience, that closeness required surrender. Every hug felt like a lock, every smile like a command. Rachel didn't realize that what she thought was love was actually possession, a kind of darkness that followed her everywhere. Even when he wasn't in the room, his words lingered long after he spoke them, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp, but always heavy enough to remind her who held the power. He knew the right phrases to twist guilt into her chest, to remind her that her life belonged to him, that everything she had was because of his sacrifices. He painted himself as both the hero and the cage, the one she should thank while also being the one she could never escape. His love was not freedom, it was a shadow that grew darker the more she tried to step into her own light. Rachel noticed the way his presence silenced everyone else. When he walked into the room, conversations died, her mother's shoulders stiffened, her laughter faded. It was as if the air itself bent to his authority. Rachel felt it most deeply. Her body would tense, her hands would fidget, her thoughts would scatter. He didn't need to raise his voice to control her. His silence alone carried the weight of unspoken threats. His shadow didn't just stretch over her, it stretched over the entire house, swallowing the walls, the furniture, the air they breathed. The darker truth lay in how much of herself she lost to his shadow. She measured her every move against his reactions, always calculating what might set him off, what might earn his approval, what might avoid his disappointment. His love was conditional, built on her submission, and she molded herself to fit inside it. She smiled when he expected it, stayed quiet when he demanded it, and allowed her own desires to shrink smaller and smaller until they nearly disappeared. In his shadow, there was no room for her light, only the reflection of what he wanted her to be. And yet, to those outside, he was the doting father, the man who never let his daughter go without. They couldn't see the way his gaze followed her too closely, the way his hand lingered too long on her shoulder, the way his protection suffocated her rather than freed her. His love was never love in its purest form. It was ownership, a darkness masked as devotion, a bond that tightened like chains. Rachel carried that shadow with her everywhere she went, and even in moments of laughter, even when surrounded by others, she felt its grip, reminding her that love should never feel this heavy, this consuming, this dark. Asterisk, the silence of a mother who knows too much is heavier than any spoken word, and Rachel felt that weight long before she ever understood what it meant. Her mother was the quiet figure in the background, always moving through the house like a shadow herself, tending to chores, serving meals, nodding along when her father spoke. She rarely argued, rarely challenged, rarely raised her voice. At first, Rachel thought this was simply who she was, gentle, submissive, a woman who believed peace was worth more than honesty. But as Rachel grew, she began to see the cracks in her mother's quiet. Silence wasn't gentleness. Silence was fear. Her mother's eyes said everything, her mouth refused to. They darted away at the wrong moments, brimmed with tears at the smallest questions, and hardened whenever Rachel tried to press for answers. Whenever Rachel mentioned her father in ways that seemed off, her mother's lips tightened, her shoulders stiffened, and her hands busied themselves with meaningless tasks, folding laundry that was already folded, scrubbing dishes that were already clean. It was as though silence was her only shield, her only way of keeping the truth at bay. But to Rachel, that silence became unbearable, a constant reminder that something unspoken lived in the air between them. There were nights when Rachel would hear the faintest sound of crying from her mother's room, muffled sobs buried in the dark. She never went in, never asked, because she feared what the answer might be. Deep down, she knew those tears weren't about arguments or disappointment or the struggles of life. They were about something deeper, something dangerous. Her mother's silence wasn't just her on it, was a prison built around Rachel too, a warning to never push too hard, never dig too deep. Still, Rachel couldn't help but notice how her mother looked at her, as if carrying a secret she desperately wanted to share but couldn't. That look, a blend of sorrow and apology, haunted Rachel more than any harsh word ever could. It was the gaze of someone who knew her daughter's innocence wasn't real anymore, that the truth lurking beneath their family's perfect surface would one day swallow her whole. It was a gaze of guilt, of complicity, of someone who had chosen survival over confession. Her mother's silence spread like poison. It filled the dinner table, where conversations were short and controlled. It filled the car rides, where only the hum of the engine dared to exist. It filled the nights, where Rachel lay awake listening for signs of a truth she couldn't name. And worst of all, it filled Rachel herself, teaching her that some things were better left unspoken, that secrets could be buried alive and still breathe in the walls of a home. Rachel tried to break through it once. Late one evening when her mother was folding clothes, she asked, "Mom, did he ever do something he shouldn't have?" Her mother froze, hands still on the fabric, her back stiff. She didn't turn around. She didn't answer. All she said, in a trembling whisper, was, "Don't ask me that." And then she left the room, leaving Rachel with more questions than before, and a deeper ache in her chest. The silence became a language of its own between them. Every time Rachel needed comfort, her mother offered her eyes instead of words. Every time she longed for truth, her mother turned her face away. Rachel wanted to hate her for it, for knowing something and saying nothing, for choosing cowardice over protection, but she couldn't, because woven into that silence was fear, and Rachel could feel it. Her mother wasn't silent out of cruelty. She was silent because she believed it was the only way to survive the shadow that loomed over them both. The hardest part was realizing that her mother's silence wasn't protecting Rachel at all. It was protecting him. Every unspoken word was a shield around her father. Every withheld truth, a layer of armor that allowed him to move freely, unchecked, unchallenged. Rachel's anger grew quietly, feeding on the silence, twisting into confusion and betrayal. The one person she thought would save her was the very person who had chosen to stay quiet, who had chosen loyalty to fear over love for her daughter. And yet, even with all this, Rachel clung to her mother's presence, because silence, even suffocating silence, was still better than abandonment. The quiet glances, the wordless hugs, the trembling hands that brushed against hers, these became her only fragments of comfort in a home where truth was forbidden. But every time Rachel tried to rest in that comfort, she was reminded of the unspoken. Her mother knew, she had always known, and that knowledge, buried and locked away, would eventually become the very thing that tore them apart. Late-night whispers that carry unbearable truths are the kind that seep into the cracks of silence, finding their way into Rachel's restless mind when the rest of the house should have been asleep. She often lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of the streetlight bleeding through her curtains, while the hum of the night pressed heavily around her. It was in those hours, when the world felt still, that whispers surfaced, not always in words she could fully catch, but in tones, in fragments, in unfinished sentences that dissolved into the walls. Sometimes, the whispers came from her parents' room, a low murmur, her father's voice heavy with insistence, her mother's breaking under the strain of something she couldn't say aloud. Rachel would press her ear against her pillow, straining to decipher, but the words never came whole, just sharp edges. "Don't," followed by silence. "She doesn't know." Drowned in a hushed reply, "It's better this way." Then nothing, always nothing. That nothingness was worse than hearing the full truth, because it left Rachel's mind to stitch together possibilities, each one darker than the last. Other times, the whispers weren't from her parents at all. They were in her own head, echoing from memories that felt blurred but not erased. A laugh from her father that sounded too sharp, a touch on her shoulder that lingered too long, her mother's voice breaking as she told her, years ago, "Go to bed, honey. Don't ask questions." These fragments returned in the night, like ghosts, whispering into her ear, "You already know. You've always known." The house itself seemed to hold whispers. The creak of the floorboards under her father's steps at odd hours, the soft click of a door closing when no one should be awake, the faint sound of something being moved in the attic or basement. Each sound was small enough to dismiss in daylight, but in the midnight hours, they carried unbearable weight. Rachel felt them in her chest like warnings, telling her that the truth was walking the halls, restless, waiting for her to uncover it. Her fear grew sharper the night she woke to her parents arguing in hushed voices. She couldn't hear everything, but she heard enough. Her mother pleading, find out, she's not a child anymore." And her father, colder, firmer, "She'll never know unless you open your mouth." Then a slam of silence, thick and choking, followed by footsteps stomping down the hall. Rachel lay frozen under her blanket, heart hammering. Realizing she wasn't imagining it anymore, there was something hidden, something fragile and terrible, balanced on the edge of their whispers. Whispers didn't stop at night. They followed her into her dreams. She'd see flashes of her younger self, standing in a dimly lit room, her father's shadow looming behind her mother's tear-streaked face watching from the doorway but saying nothing. She'd wake trembling, unsure if the memory was real or a dream conjured by her subconscious. But the more she tried to convince herself it was only a dream, the more the whispers pressed against her, like a truth clawing its way out of silence. Rachel started to notice that even in daylight, her parents carried whispers in their eyes, a glance exchanged across the table that lasted too long, her father's voice dropping when he said her name, her mother's refusal to meet her gaze when questions lingered in the air. She began to live in a world of half-truths, where nothing was said outright but everything was implied. And at night, when she lay in bed, all those unspoken words unraveled in her head, forming truths she wished she could deny. It was unbearable because whispers have no closure. They never give you enough to hold on to, only enough to wound you. Rachel's chest ached with the weight of what she didn't know, with the fear that knowing might destroy her, but not knowing was destroying her too. Each whisper felt like a thread unraveling from a tightly woven fabric, and every night, the fabric of her family grew thinner, weaker, closer to tearing apart. The unbearable part wasn't just the suspicion, it was the loneliness. Rachel couldn't share these whispers with anyone. Who would believe her if she said her father's love felt wrong? If she confessed that her mother's silence was filled with secrets? If she admitted that the house itself seemed to whisper warnings at night? To outsiders, her family was whole. To Rachel, it was a maze of shadows and echoes, and the whispers were the only guides she had, guides that led her deeper into fear, deeper into truth, deeper into a darkness she wasn't sure she wanted to reach. And yet, no matter how unbearable they became, she couldn't shut them out. She listened. Every night, she listened, because she knew, buried inside those whispers, the truth waited. A truth that would not stay hidden forever. A secret buried in old photographs and locked drawers has a way of breathing even when hidden, and Rachel could feel its presence long before she ever touched it with her hands. The house held more than just furniture and memories. It held pieces of the past that her father and mother worked tirelessly to keep sealed away. But no matter how deep they buried it, Rachel felt its pulse, as if the truth lived just behind the walls, waiting for her to stumble upon it. She first noticed it in the family photo albums. They sat on the bottom shelf of the living room cabinet, thick with dust, never opened unless company came. As a child, she loved flipping through them, pointing at her own smiling face, laughing at her crooked hair or missing teeth. But as she grew older, she began to see something else, photos that felt incomplete, cropped too tightly, or showing smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. There were pictures where her mother's arm was wrapped too tightly around her father's hand gripping her shoulder with a possessiveness that seemed more like a warning than affection. In some, Rachel herself looked different, her smile stiff, her gaze a little too distant, as though even as a child, some part of her knew what the camera couldn't capture. One night, unable to sleep, she pulled the albums out again. Her fingers trembled as she turned the pages, scanning faces she thought she knew, yet finding unfamiliar expressions etched across them. She found photographs tucked between the pages, ones she didn't remember ever seeing. In one, she was barely 5 years old, sitting on her father's lap. His smile was wide, but his eyes were sharp, watchful. Her own expression in the picture made her stomach twist. She wasn't smiling at all. Instead, her lips were pressed thin, her body leaning slightly away, as if her small self already knew something her older self was only now beginning to grasp. But photographs weren't the only place where the past lingered. There were drawers in the house that no one spoke of. Her father kept a locked drawer in his study, one he never allowed Rachel near. As a child, she thought it was filled with boring paperwork files, tax forms, things she wouldn't understand. But over time, curiosity gnawed at her, especially after catching her mother once, in the middle of the night, trying to open it with trembling hands before shoving the key back in her pocket when she heard footsteps. The look on her mother's face when their eyes met was enough to silence Rachel for years. It wasn't the look of someone caught snooping. It was the look of someone drowning in a secret too big to confess. Rachel's curiosity turned into obsession. She began to notice other locked places around the house. The basement trunk with the heavy padlock, The small wooden box in her parents' closet, even the attic door that her father always insisted stayed shut. Each lock wasn't just a barrier, it was a message. There's something here you're not meant to see. And the more she was kept away, the more her heart ached to uncover it. Her opportunity came one afternoon when her father wasn't home, and her mother had fallen asleep in the living room chair. Rachel crept into the study, her palms slick with sweat, her breath shallow. The locked drawer stared back at her, daring her. She searched frantically through the room until she found a small brass key hidden inside an old book. Her heart hammered as she slid it into the lock, the click of it turning echoing through the quiet house like a scream. Inside, she found envelopes stuffed with photographs, not the staged kind from albums, but raw, unguarded moments. In some, she was asleep in her bed, the picture taken from the doorway. In others, she was outside playing, unaware of the camera. But the ones that chilled her most were the ones where she was with her father, his hand always somewhere on her, his eyes locked on her with an intensity that no camera should have ever caught. These weren't photographs of love, they were evidence of possession, of obsession, of something that had no right to be called fatherly. Alongside the photographs were journals. She flipped them open, her father's handwriting scrawled across the pages. She only caught fragments before panic made her slam them shut. Phrases about keeping her close, about no one else understanding, about protecting her from the world. Words twisted into something grotesque, making her feel sick. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, buried under locks and keys, as if secrecy could erase the weight of what those pages revealed. Rachel shoved everything back, locked the drawer again, and placed the key exactly where she found it. Her hands shook uncontrollably, her throat burning with the scream she couldn't release. The photographs, the words, the locked drawers, they weren't just pieces of a secret. They were proof that her entire life had been built on lies, that her father's love was darker than she could have ever imagined, and that her mother's silence wasn't ignorance at all. It was complicity. Every time she walked past that study afterward, Rachel felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. The drawer seemed to call her name, whispering that she had only scratched the surface, that deeper truths still lay hidden in the photographs and journals she hadn't dared to read. And though she locked it all away again, she knew nothing could ever truly bury it. The secret lived there waiting, and no matter how hard she tried to pretend otherwise, Rachel now carried it inside her, heavy and inescapable. Asterisk: when truth surfaces, family turns into strangers, and for Rachel, that transformation was not sudden, but agonizingly slow, like watching the familiar dissolve into something unrecognizable before her very eyes. The house that once carried the rhythm of her childhood, the laughter in the kitchen, the warmth of bedtime stories, the smell of her mother's cooking became a cage of lies, every wall echoing with the truth she could no longer unsee. What she uncovered in photographs, in whispers, in silences, sat in her chest like a stone, and suddenly the people she loved most became distorted, their faces reshaped by betrayal. Her father, once the pillar of strength in her life, now looked like a stranger wearing the mask of a protector. His every word rang hollow, every smile calculated. She could see the control in his eyes now, the way his love was never love, but a net designed to trap her. He moved through the house with the same authority. But Rachel no longer saw a parency, saw a man who had stolen her innocence under the guise of protection. His shadow no longer stretched over her in silence. It pressed down with suffocating weight, and now that she knew, every step he took filled her with dread. He hadn't changed, not outwardly, but she had. Knowledge made him monstrous. Her mother's silence cut even deeper. It was one thing to be betrayed by the man she should have been able to trust above all else, but her mother's refusal to speak, her years of quiet complicity, turned that betrayal into something unbearable. Rachel couldn't look at her without seeing the secrets her lips refused to release, the tears she shed behind closed doors but never used to save her daughter. Her mother's eyes were full of sorrow, guilt, even love, but none of it mattered anymore. Love without protection was useless. Love wrapped in silence was poison. The woman Rachel once ran to for comfort now felt like a stranger to, a ghost trapped in her own silence, too broken or too afraid to ever be the mother Rachel needed. Family dinners became unbearable performances. Her father's questions about her day, once casual, now sounded like interrogations, each word laced with hidden meaning. Her mother's attempts at small talk only widened the silence between them. Rachel would sit at the table, pushing food around her plate, unable to speak, because the truth had hollowed her voice. She was surrounded by people who looked like family but felt like impostors, strangers playing roles in a drama too cruel to escape. Outside the house, the illusion continued. Neighbors waved, teachers praised her father's dedication. Friends commented on how lucky Rachel was to have parents so involved. Each compliment felt like a blade, slicing deeper into the wound of knowing that the truth was invisible to everyone else. She wanted to scream, to shatter the facade, to expose the darkness that thrived behind locked doors, but her throat held the scream, and she stayed silent, carrying the unbearable weight of truth while the world admired the lie. The more Rachel tried to cling to the idea of family, the more it slipped from her grasp. Memories of holidays, of birthdays, of nights curled up on the couch watching movies, none of them felt real anymore. They were poisoned by what she knew, warped by the shadows she could no longer ignore. She replayed them in her mind, searching for signs she had missed, and the more she searched, the more she saw the cracks. Her childhood, her trust, her love, it had all been built on a fragile surface, and now that surface had collapsed, leaving only strangers where her family once stood. The hardest part was the isolation. Truth should have freed her, but instead, it imprisoned her further. She couldn't look at her father without disgust, couldn't look at her mother without sorrow, couldn't look at herself without shame. The people who should have been her safe haven were the very ones she needed saving from. Family, once her anchor, had become her storm. And every time she tried to imagine a way forward, she found herself standing alone, surrounded not by loved ones, but by strangers she happened to share blood with. In the end, Rachel realized the truth had destroyed more than her trust. It had destroyed the very meaning of family. Blood no longer meant safety, a house no longer meant home, and the people who raised her were no longer hers. They were strangers draped in the illusion of kinship, bound not by love, but by secrets, silence, and shadows.